Good evening, everyone. Today we have our beloved guest Gopalakrishnan. We have already done a podcast with him on near-death experience, and sir, we have received a phenomenal feedback on near-death experience. It was a really, educational for the spiritual speaker seekers, and today we're gonna touch on. Some more topics about near-death experience, how it affects our purpose of life, and how it is how to understand NDE. Today's podcast is gonna be very intense about NDE. So, sir, I would like to I request you to share your introduction. So that there are news viewers who are watching directly the second episode, then they have the introduction about you. Over to you, sir.
Namaskar to all of you. Namaskar to Mr. Modi too. And so I wish to introduce myself as Gopalakrishnan. And professionally, I was in the field of coastal engineering, which is application of civil engineering to coastal problems. And I was working at IIT Madras and then and the North Carolina State University in US, and then in Kuwait on this research and teaching of coastal engineering. So during my professional days, I was also interested in the philosophic aspects of life on this planet. And so I was in touch with the messages from Jiddu Krishnamurti, Ramana Maharishi, Eckhart Tolle, and such people. And also during the 1980s, the new topic came up, near-death experience. And after that, the first book was titled Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody. And it was followed by other books and with the titles Life Before Life, Life Between Life, and such things. So it had been very educative going through those episodes, because then we begin to understand the spirituality beyond the religious concepts. And so that kind of spirituality is universal. It is not the pet topic of any group. There is no group psychology involved in it. And that's what made me interested in it. And then I wrote a book on those, on the understanding of those messages. That was called The In Quest of the Deeper Self. Later, it's now revised and published by John Hunt Publishing Company in England with the title The Journey into Oneself. I'll give you some details of this book towards the end of this podcast. Right now, Mr. Jenish Modi will have some questions and I'll try to answer them.
Sure, sir. Thank you for your introduction. And
Welcome.
sir, we're gonna start with about NDE, but let's have a little background about what is NDE. Although we have covered this NDE in the first episode, but
Yes.
I think before we go into depth of NDE, we should have a little bit background for the viewers what NDE is, and then how does the knowledge of NDE influences our sense of purpose in life?
Okay. So let's go into this subject. Near-death experience is experienced by people who die for a short time, either because of heart attack or cerebral seizure. So as a result, during those 5 or 10 minutes when the ECG and EEG are both flat, the person is considered clinically dead. At that time, after they are resuscitated, during that short time, they experience some extraordinary levels of consciousness far beyond the concepts of the conventional mind. And so when they share those things with us, we get a sort of rejuvenated feeling about our living on this planet, because we step out of the conventional mind at least for a short time. And then what happens is their messages, the primary message is that there is really no death to the essence of ourselves, the soul is usually called. The death is only to the body, and the soul just moves from one form to another and experiences some proximity to divinity in the form of a bright light and abundant love coming from that light, the likes of which we don't experience during our stay on the earth. So, with that understanding, we feel that we have more to know about ourselves from what the NDE people say, and then it gives us some meaning and purpose to living because we look at life from beyond the ego. Usually, the conventional mind looks at everything in the form of I, me, and the mine. My country, my religion, my language kind of identification is very strong, and people act from that identification. So there is clash, argument, conflict, and war. But during the NDE, they experience a state of consciousness in which the ego is absent. So there is only understanding from the essence of ourselves, which may be called the true self. And whatever they say helps us look at life with renewed interest away from the usual regret, anger, fear, and such feelings of the conventional mind. So we find that everyday life changes from this impact of I, me, and the mind to something wider, an awareness that's much wider than that of the ego. And then we find that every day becomes an important day in life. That's what makes it truly live. J. Krishnamurti was asked by some people, what is the purpose of life? And he just laughed and said, the purpose of life is to live. And that living is denied because we approach everything through the ego. And once we step out of it, life is beautiful. Our relationships change, and the self importance begins to water down. So we look at everybody with some sacredness, with some a rejuvenated feeling for them. We look at them as their souls instead of the ego based image we have about themselves. So that is why we find after we listen to the NDE people, we are able to look at life from a wider perspective away from the ego's limited awareness. So that is the primary thing, and we begin to understand that there is more to life than we knew through the ego, and we become very thrilled, and also we begin to love life for whatever it brings and not take sort of objections to some happenings. Then that's what makes it live truly. So the purpose of life is to live and also experience everything fully instead of blocking some things and getting attracted and attached to some other things. That thing stops. And the second thing, Mr. Modi, you mentioned about after the purpose and meaningfulness, you mentioned something.
How does the knowledge of near-death experience influences our sense of purpose in life?
Yeah, this is what I just explained. Because then we begin to look at life primarily from the point of view away from the ego. And so there is compassion in our relationship, less reaction from the ego. And then there is this abundant feeling for everything that we meet in life from morning till night. Life becomes very abundant, vibrant. So that is the major impact. Also, along with it comes the dissolution of the fear of death. And so that also makes life a little more cheerful. And these are the points I wanted to share with you.
Sir, since you have mentioned about Jiddu Krishnamurti, he was a revolutionary man of 19th century in spiritual world. So How do you see his perspective on the nature of consciousness and its role in spiritual growth? What is the Krishnamurti has to say about nature of the consciousness?
Okay. He says that um, if you are carried away by the conventional mind, there is limited perspective on everything, everything being looked at of what use is this to me, very self-centered. When you step out of this conventional mind, the whole thing changes, and we begin to understand that we have not been living properly. In order to do that, we must step out of this cage that we build around ourselves. And the primary thing that will help us step out is the understanding that thinker is the thought, meaning that there is no thinking person thinking thoughts. Thought and thinker arise at the same time. And that's how we get caught in the habitual neurology based on the ego's importance. And so Krishnamurti's messages are built around this fact that there is no thinker apart from the thought, and that awareness will help us look at life differently from the conventional mind. And then the self-awareness is with us during the daytime, and self-awareness may be considered as the most fundamental virtue, because when it is there, other virtues fall in place. For example, Krishnamurti's statement is to know that one is arrogant is a moment of humility, because when there is self-awareness, all good things come in. And so his emphasis is on sustaining the self-awareness during the lifetime, during the daytime, and it is taken away. The self-awareness is pushed aside by the self-importance, the conventional thought forms.
Sir, there are many belief systems in us, right? So,
Yes.
what place do belief system play in understanding the universal spirituality?
I think the belief systems are built primarily around the ego. So we find in most religious practices there is this exclusivism, meaning that mine is the only way, kind of egoistic thought. So belief systems do not help people move into universal consciousness, because its purpose is to get make the person go to heaven, please God and go to heaven kind of psychology. So they are not interested in exploring into universal consciousness. As a result, people who are emotionally attached to belief systems will not like this topic of universal consciousness. In fact, they have NDEs which seem to support their belief system of heaven and hell. Quite a few people who are strongly attached to religion experience exactly what they are conditioned to believe in. So they get confirmed that they are really in the good books of God, so they will go to heaven after death. Their whole primary purpose seems to please God and go to heaven, and not understand what lies beyond the apparent. So that is why this belief systems are an obstruction to understanding spirituality beyond the religions. In fact, they don't like such things like spirituality beyond the religions, and also such things like universal consciousness. There is also the point that in spirituality, quite a few near-death experience people talk about after the experience, I'm more spiritual than religious, and they tend to move away from the conventional belief system and try to understand spirituality beyond the religions. So the people who are emotionally attached to belief system don't want to give it up, and whatever happens in their NDE seems to support their idea of heaven and hell. They experience such things correspondingly. And they don't experience the universal oneness and the universal connectedness that NDE people experience when they are not attached to any belief system, when they are free, they go to the wider consciousness, they come back and tell us about the universal oneness. That's the Advaitic feeling, and also interconnectedness of all beings. So such things do not happen in the NDE of people who are strongly attached to religious background. So my feeling is, as long as there is this attachment to belief systems, they cannot experience what lies beyond the apparent and the universal consciousness.
You have mentioned about the attachment. What exactly the attachment is in the spirituality? Because there are the concepts running like, you have to understand the detachment, and you don't have to be attached with everyone to be a spiritual person. So how do one understand what is attachment, and if there is a detachment, then what is the detachment?
Okay. Now, the thought created I, which is generally called the ego, but the word ego is sort of derogatory. So let's use the term outer self. The I created by thought, the outer self, is afraid of being pushed aside. So it wants to cling to some people, attachment to people, or cling to some philosophy or religion. It gives the outer self a feeling of being somebody. And that's why people want to become famous, because then they think they are somebody and they cannot be destroyed. The outer self feels good in that case. That is, attachment to the image that one has about oneself, the image that society has created in them. And that image, attachment to that image, is what causes the ego. And so we find that this attachment leads to problems because the outer self doesn't like being pushed down. And even in simple arguments, it wants to win because there is indirectly the fear of death. If I am pushed aside, I will die kind of fear. The outer self has that fear, and that's why it wants to prevail over others in arguments, and finally it ends up in war and so on. So the attachment is essentially a characteristic of the outer self. The thought created habitual neurology produces this image about oneself, and that outer self is always in the lookout for some attachment to people, attachment to conclusions, philosophies, property, and so on. So without that, the outer self will feel insecure. That is why most people end up with attachment to some of these things. And so that creates problems for oneself and others. And the detachment comes through self-awareness. Attachment cannot be pushed aside through effort, because all effort comes from the outer self. So J. Krishnamurti's primary point is no effort can dissolve the ego or the outer self, only quiet self-awareness. Like if somebody is angry, and the self-awareness at the time of being angry does something to that anger. And similarly, watching oneself functioning in attachment, it is that self awareness that can dissolve the attachment, not the effort to get rid of it.
Sir, we say that spirituality is beyond the religions, right? So, how does it help us to understand the higher power and universal energy associated with our inner revolution? Sorry, evolution.
Yes, inner evolution, yes. It is the deeper the self awareness, the more evolved we are, because in the conventional state of mind, the outer self is very strong, and so it reduces the awareness level. The stronger the outer self, lesser the awareness. And when we begin to see it, we come bring in this self-awareness to the point of gradually dissolving the outer self, and that is the evolution part. Like we evolve through awareness. The deeper the awareness, less strong is the outer self. Ultimately, through deepening self-awareness, the outer self is completely dissolved. That's the state of liberation in which the human being is no longer controlled by the outer self, but by the universal consciousness. The unspoiled consciousness begins to function in the brain instead of the habitual neurology.
When you mention about habitual neurology, does it something has to do with our brain, the neural patterns?
Yes, because from childhood, we grow in an atmosphere of self-importance. Everybody around us is working on that. And so the child gets caught in that kind of self-importance, and the brain is conditioned from young days. That's what causes the habitual neurology. The I, me, and the mind begins to get strengthened as the child grows. And that habitual neurology controls the psychology as the child grows up, and that leads to the strengthening of the outer self. It creates problems for oneself and others.
How can the awareness and understanding of NDE
Hmm.
contribute to personal growth, healing, and deeper connection to spirituality for individuals who have encountered such experiences or are curious about them? You know, those who are newly spiritual seekers.
Yes. So the primary thing NDE people come back with uh, is the impact they have from there of unconditional love. Like, for example, normally the psychology is that person belongs to my group, therefore I love him, kind of conditional love, which is no love at all. But during the NDE, they experience this love, which is unconditional, and they want to share it with people so that there will be harmony in the world, in the personal life, individual life, also in the collective life. So NDE's primary impact is, there are two primary impacts. One is the fear of death is gone, but we are intrinsically immortal. Nothing can destroy us, the true self. And the second thing is this unconditional love that comes through watching people and seeing them as ourselves. And in that is how, in the daily life, the NDE people uh, seem to be more relaxed, less reactive, and they say that they don't get involved in any arguments. And they see arguments as a fundamental sin. So they move away from such things. They see the aggressiveness of the outer self, and that is how NDE can help the evolution and take us to the higher levels of consciousness, because the near-death experience, people come back from it with two major impacts. One of the things is the loss of fear of death. And the second thing is the unconditional love towards everybody and everything. The first thing, there is loss of fear of death because we understand, the NDE people understand that at our essence level, we are immortal and nothing can destroy that. So that's what makes them lose the fear of death. The second thing is unconditional love. It comes in because basically we are loving beings. What spoils it is the outer self-importance. So we find that after NDE, people become more compassionate and not base it on any identification like the other person belongs to my religion, therefore I like him, kind of conditional love. Is no love at all. That's so during the NDE and after the NDE, they understand that at the level of our essence, we are all the same. And that sameness, universal oneness, is what makes them love everybody without any identification. That's how the NDE people are at a slightly more evolved level, because they look at everybody as themselves. And so they won't hurt anyone, and they become compassionate. Also, they become eager to understand what lies beyond the apparent. Because during the NDE, they experience something extraordinary that is not within the understanding of the ego self. It is completely outside, and they experience many things that cannot be within the conventional thought forms.
Perspective, how does the science see the near-death experience?
Okay, science is based on the five senses reports. So, in general, it cannot probe too much into the region of spirituality because that's beyond the five senses. So, whatever the NDE people report cannot be tested except for what is known as veridical experience, meaning that whatever they say can be verified to see what they see is true. For example, during the NDE, suppose the doctor says something to another about the position of the patient or some such thing during the time when the patient is supposed to be dead. The patient comes back and tells the others exactly what one doctor told the other. And this is very surprising because the brain was not functioning at that time. So it is in a field of consciousness where the five senses cannot move in. Science is basically based on the five senses report. So my feeling is scientific analysis cannot go very far, except for talking about some alpha waves and things like that. But it's a region where the conventional science cannot do much work. So we have to trust the ND people on what they are saying because they are talking from a level of consciousness where science cannot enter.
Okay.
Okay, shall we start the slideshow? Okay, now it's on the screen, right? The slide. Okay, now this is the title of this first slide is effervescence paradigm. We all know from our study of science what effervescence is. It is a liquid that bubbles up and then comes off as vapor, and that means some molecules leave the main fluid mass like that. This is a metaphor for our universal consciousness. Let me go to the next slide and talk about what that is. See, here we see at the bottom some boxes like religious systems, atheism, agnosticism, meditative systems, and rationalistic systems. People usually tend to belong to one of these boxes because that's the conclusion they like. There's the proverb that one believes what one wants to believe. It's very important one to note because the outer self gets caught in that proclivity of one believes what one wants to believe. So these boxes tend to keep its people arrested on some beliefs, and they are not supposed to question those fundamental beliefs of those systems. And so they are sort of controlled in a box like thing, and they have to conform to what that box says. And we know that the group psychology is similar to mob psychology, except that there's a difference in level of violence. Otherwise, the group psychology is very similar to box psychology in that both of them are controlled by herd mentality. That is, the group mentality is the herd mentality. So if a person belongs to a particular religion and that he or she would like to maintain those conclusions of the group, conform to them and repeat them, but they are not allowed to step out of the box. If they step out, they will be ostracized, removed from the groups. They won't be liked. So we find that this is what is controlling the human psychology, and much of the confusion and conflict arises from this kind of box psychology. And some of us who listen to the enlightened beings and are interested in spirituality beyond the religions step out of all these boxes and are not controlled by any conclusion of any box. So then when we do that, we effervesce into the region of freedom. These red arrows indicate the effervescence, and we effervesce from any of these boxes because we see that these boxes are very confining, stifling in a way, in terms of our understanding of what lies beyond the apparent. So we effervesce first into the region of freedom, cross the line of transcendence, because then we see we are alone and approach life completely from our own perception. And so we are not controlled by any group psychology. And once we move into the region of freedom, we release ourselves from all this slavery, conformist slavery. And so then we begin to discover what lies beyond the apparent. And for these people, NDE has a great deal to give. NDE messages have a great deal to tell them because those messages generally don't conform to any group psychology. But people who come from strong attachment to belief systems, their NDE messages are very similar to their religious situation. They still talk from within the box and rarely talk about universal oneness and universal connectedness. So we move away from those NDEs which are controlled by belief systems and move into those which are free. And then we find that those messages help us enjoy the region of freedom. We become free beings and then grow into the universal consciousness in due course because of deepening self awareness. So, this is the general scheme of things in terms of the psychology, human psychology. And as I mentioned, ND plays a very favorable role for people who are willing to free themselves from all boxes and move into the region of freedom and subsequently into the universal consciousness. So that's what this one, it just gives a picture of what is going on in the world. Now, I want to say a few things about the book. I have written, The Journey into Oneself. And this one, the next slides give the salient features. This is published by John Hunt Company from England. They have a branch in the US also. The subtitle of this book is An Exploration of Universal Spirituality. So, universal spirituality in the sense that it doesn't belong to any group. Sectarian feelings are not in that spirituality. So, now let's go to the next slide, giving some salient features, essentials of the book. Number one, natural spirituality. That is spirituality beyond the conventional paths. The book explains something about this natural spirituality. The second one is the importance of self awareness and its place in the inner radical transformation. This phrase radical transformation was used by Jiddu Krishnamurti, meaning that the brain will be completely altered, freed from the conditioned response due to deepening self awareness. So the book deals with something about the radical transformation. The third one, subsidence of the noisy mind, the silent mind and its benefits in daily life. People know that their minds are constantly chattering and that dissipates the energy, also makes them get into problems of fear, anger, regret, loneliness, persecution, complex, jealousy, envy, and so on. All this is, those things are symptoms of a noisy mind. So the question will come as how does the noise subside? Effort cannot help. So if effort cannot help, what can bring about the silence in the mind? That's one of the major issues in the book. So we begin to find that the noise subsides as we pay attention to some of the things mentioned in the book. So then there is confidence that we can be free of the problems created by the noisy mind. The fourth one is understanding death, NDE, and reincarnation, that plays in inner transformation. Because once we understand that we have more than one life, as mentioned by many NDE people, then we begin to understand we are on a long journey and not confined to one life. So the claustrophobia in time is removed when we understand reincarnation and that we can plan our lives if we bring in self-awareness. Our destiny can be guided by deepening self-awareness. This aspect is in the book about understanding these three things: death, NDE, and reincarnation. Now, let's go to the next one. Uh, where is the thing? Yes. The fifth one, Sage Kapila's Sankhya philosophy, the cosmological situation of the universe we are in. Now, Sage Kapila lived about 600 years BCE, somewhat around the time of the Buddha. And he came up with a cosmological model where he said there are two primal issues, Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the primal divine energy and intelligence from which all manifestations take place. Prakriti is the manifested form of Purusha. That's what the universe is, the material universe, and also the living beings. They are all from the primal source, Purusha. So what happens is Purusha creates the Prakriti, the nature, and then a spark from the flame escapes into Prakriti, experiences the many manifestations, and after enough self-awareness returns to the source, to the Purusha again. So it's a cyclic process. The spark leaves the flame and returns to the flame after experiencing many things in the manifested universe. This is explained in the sixth chapter. And then we go on to innovative ideas on caring for physical health and sleep. This lays the right foundation for the inner transformation. So we begin to take care of our physical health because that foundation is very important for psychological evolution. And then monism, which is the English term for Advaita, spiritual philosophy. There's an interesting statement in the chapter on Advaita. One of the Japanese authors, he has written an article in the Ramanashram journal, Mountain Path. The title of the article was about monism, and in that the author says, if you chase monism, if you chase moksha, it won't come. And if you don't chase moksha, it won't come. It's an interesting, self-contradicting statement, but he goes on to explain what happens when you are deeply interested in moksha. Then you find that you come to a state of being stumped. You can't go this way, you can't go that way. And in that stumped state, moksha takes place. So it's an interesting one. And last one is about there are three appendices in the book dealing with practical examples of universal consciousness. Three different individuals who fall into it, they talk about the state of oneness with the universe. And so that concludes the book. And then I just want to tell you that for any discussion on NDE and afterlife and my book, you may contact me at the email ID. I'll be glad to communicate with you. And then we have thank you for watching and listening. And thanks, Mr. Modi, for giving me this opportunity. Yes.
Thank you, Gopal sir, for exploring the near-death experience in a
You're
profound,
welcome.
glimpse way.
Yeah,
Like,
welcome.
we hope this discussion has sparked the, curiosity and uh,
Mm.
encouraging to listeners to,
Yes.
deeper, delve deeper into this profound and transformative experiences.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
Thank you, Gopal sir.
Welcome. Namaskar. Yeah.
Namaskar.